Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of crackling flames, looking out your window to see your barn engulfed in fire, and later discovering it was deliberately set by members of a homeowners association, all because you refused to join their exclusive little club. That's exactly what happened to me, and if you think that sounds insane, just wait until you hear about the $500,000 lawsuit that followed. This is a story about standing your ground, knowing your rights, and fighting back when others try to bully you into submission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started 3 years ago when I, Jackson Miller, purchased my dream property on the outskirts of Pinewood Valley. After 15 years of saving every penny from my construction business, I finally had enough to buy this 12-acre parcel of land with a modest farmhouse, a large barn, and enough space to start the small organic farming operation I'd always dreamed about. The property was perfect, secluded enough to give me the peace and quiet I craved after years of living in the city, yet close enough to town to make selling my produce at the local farmers market practical. The previous owner had used it primarily for hay production, but I had bigger plans. I wanted to create a sustainable farm focusing on heritage vegetables and free-range chickens. What made this property particularly attractive was its location. It sat at the edge of the county line, bordering a newer housing development called the Groves at Pinewood on one side, but otherwise surrounded by open countryside. I was technically outside the city limits, which meant fewer restrictions on what I could do with my land. The first few months were everything I'd hoped they would be. I spent my days fixing up the farmhouse, clearing fields, and preparing the soil for my first growing season. I set up a small greenhouse, put in irrigation systems, and converted part of the barn into a workshop where I could maintain my equipment. Life was good, and I felt like I was finally living my dream. Then one Saturday morning in early spring, as I was out tending to my newly planted rows of heirloom tomatoes, a black SUV pulled up my gravel driveway. A woman in her 50s stepped out, dressed in a blazer and slacks that seemed oddly formal for a weekend visit to a farm. She introduced herself as Deborah Winters, the president of the Groves at Pinewood Homeowners Association. "Mr. Miller," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "I've been meaning to stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood. We're so pleased to have new residents who take pride in their property." I wiped my hands on my jeans and shook her outstretched hand, noticing how she subtly wiped her palm on her slacks afterward. "Thanks, but I should clarify that I'm not actually part of your neighborhood. My property is outside the development." Her smile tightened. "Well, technically yes, but we consider all adjacent properties part of our greater community. That's actually why I'm here today." She handed me a thick envelope with the HOA logo emblazoned on it. "This is an invitation to join our association. We've recently amended our bylaws to allow for satellite memberships for properties that border our development. There are so many benefits to membership: community events, shared resources, and of course the prestige of being associated with the Groves." I took the envelope, more out of politeness than interest. "I'll take a look, but I'm pretty busy getting the farm up and running. I'm not sure I have time for community events right now." "Oh, but that's not all," Deborah continued, her voice taking on an edge. "Membership would also mean adhering to our community standards. We've noticed your property doesn't quite meet the aesthetic guidelines we've established for our neighborhood." I looked around at my farm. Yes, it was a work in progress, but it was a farm, not a manicured suburban lot. "What guidelines are you referring to exactly?" "Well, for starters, visible farm equipment is prohibited. Equipment needs to be stored in appropriate structures out of sight, and we have strict regulations about livestock, particularly chickens, which I understand you're planning to raise. The noise and odor can be quite disruptive to our residents." I couldn't believe what I was heaing. She was basically saying that to join their HOA, I'd need to stop functioning as a farm. Ms. Winters, I appreciate the invitation, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is an active farm. I specifically bought property outside any HOA precisely because I wanted the freedom to use my land as I see fit. Her smile vanished completely. Mr. Miller, perhaps I'm not making myself clear. The board is very concerned about how your activities might affect property values in the groves. We've had several complaints already about the visual impact of your operations. Complaints? I've barely gotten started. And again, this property isn't part of your development. That may be the case currently, but we're in discussions with the county about expanding our jurisdiction. It would be in your best interest to get ahead of these changes and demonstrate your willingness to be a good neighbor. The implication was clear. Join voluntarily now, or they'd try to force my hand later. I tried to remain polite, but firm. I'll review your materials, but I should be upfront that I have no intention of changing the agricultural nature of my property. This is a working farm, not a subdivision lot. Deborah's face hardened. I strongly urge you to reconsider that position, Mr. Miller. The HOA board can be very accommodating to those who cooperate, but we have ways of dealing with problems. With that thinly veiled threat hanging in the air, she turned and walked back to her SUV. As she drove away, I stood there holding the envelope, a sense of unease settling over me. Little did I know this was just the beginning of what would become a nightmare. That night, I opened the envelope and reviewed the materials. The satellite membership would cost $750 per month, an astronomical amount considering I wouldn't even be using any of their amenities. The list of restrictions was even more concerning. No visible farming equipment, no structures over 8 feet tall without prior approval, which would eliminate any practical barn or silo. No livestock within 300 feet of the property line, impossible on my 12 acres. No selling produce directly from the property. The list went on. It was obvious they weren't actually trying to include me. They were trying to force me to convert my farm into something that wouldn't offend their suburban sensibilities. I set the papers aside, deciding I would send a formal letter declining their invitation and clarifying that as a property outside their jurisdiction, I was under no obligation to consider their demands. Over the next week, I noticed increased traffic along the road that bordered my property. Cars would slow down as they passed, the occupants clearly scrutinizing my farm. Occasionally, I spotted Deborah's black SUV parked across the road, and I could see her taking photos with her phone. I tried to ignore these intrusions and focus on my work. Spring was a critical time for getting crops established, and I had seedlings that needed transplanting, irrigation lines to run, and a chicken coop to finish before my first batch of chicks arrived. Then the letters started coming. The first was a friendly reminder about the HOA's interest in my property. The second was more direct, suggesting that my non-compliance with their standards was being documented. The third dropped all pretense of friendliness, stating that the HOA board had voted unanimously to take all necessary steps to address the nuisance conditions on my property. I consulted with a local attorney, Marcus Benson, who specialized in property rights. After reviewing the letters and the HOA documents, he assured me that they had no legal standing. "They can't force you to join their association, Jackson," he said, "and they certainly can't impose their rules on your property. You're outside their jurisdiction, period." Marcus helped me draft a cease and desist letter, formally notifying the HOA that their harassment constituted intimidation and that any further attempts to pressure me would result in legal action. I felt better having taken this step, thinking it might put an end to Deborah's campaign against my farm. I was wrong. 2 days after the HOA would have received my letter, I discovered someone had cut through the wire fencing in my south field, allowing several of my newly acquired sheep to escape. Fortunately, a neighbor spotted them wandering along the road and helped me round them up before any were injured. There was no proof of who had damaged the fence, but the timing seemed suspicious. Then came the complaints to the county. Suddenly, my farm was being investigated for alleged water contamination, noise violations, and improper disposal of agricultural waste, none of which had any basis in reality. Each complaint required time-consuming inspections and documentation to disprove. The county officials were apologetic, explaining they were required to follow up on all complaints, but it was clear someone was deliberately trying to drown me in regulatory scrutiny. Through it all, I continued working on my farm, determined not to be driven off my land. I installed security cameras around the property perimeter and documented every unusual incident. Marcus advised me to keep detailed records of all interactions with the HOA and any suspicious activities, which proved to be crucial advice later on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By early summer, the harassment had escalated to direct confrontation. One evening, as I was finishing up work in the fields, a group of 3 people approached my property line. I recognized Deborah immediately, along with 2 men in polo shirts, bearing the Groves at Pinewood logo. "Mr. Miller," Deborah called out, "the board has authorized me to make you one final offer. We're willing to purchase your property at market value minus the cost of bringing it up to code. It would solve all these unfortunate issues we've been having." I approached the fence but maintained my distance. "Ms. Winters, there is no we here. You have no authority over my property, and it's not for sale. I've already sent a cease and desist letter. This conversation is over." One of the men stepped forward. "You're making a big mistake. Do you really think you can take on the entire HOA? We have resources you can't imagine. We will make it impossible for you to operate this eyesore." "Are you threatening me?" I asked, pulling out my phone and starting to record. They quickly backed away, but Deborah had one parting shot. "The board meets next week. We'll be discussing our strategy regarding your property. I suggest you reconsider your position before then." That night, I couldn't sleep. The confrontation had left me angry and unsettled. I checked and rechecked the security cameras, finally dozing off around 2 a.m. 3 hours later, I woke to the sound of my dogs barking frantically. When I looked out the window, my blood ran cold. My barn was on fire. The flames were already consuming the roof, bright against the pre-dawn darkness. I called 911 while running outside, desperately, trying to reach the small flock of chickens I'd just installed in one section of the barn. The heat was too intense to get close, the structure already collapsing in on itself. By the time the fire department arrived, there was little left to save. As I stood watching firefighters douse the smoldering remains, I noticed a car, slowly, driving past, a black SUV. It was too dark to see the driver clearly, but I didn't need to. Somehow, I knew. The fire inspector arrived later that morning. His investigation revealed accelerant had been used at multiple points around the barn's exterior. This was no accident, it was arson. I reported my suspicions about the HOA to the police, showing them the documentation of harassment I'd been keeping. They took my statement but seemed skeptical about connecting the HOA to the fire without direct evidence. The investigation was opened, but I could tell it wasn't a high priority for them. The barn had been insured, but the insurance company dragged their feet, suggesting they needed to wait for the conclusion of the arson investigation before processing my claim. Meanwhile, I was left with a charred ruin in the middle of my farm, dead livestock and destroyed equipment. It was a devastating blow, both financially and emotionally. But instead of breaking me, it hardened my resolve. If Deborah Winters and Her HOA thought this would drive me away. They had drastically underestimated who they were dealing with. The morning after the fire, I called Marcus and told him everything. We're not just sending letters anymore, I said. I want to sue them for everything they've done. Based on the pattern of harassment, we definitely have grounds for legal action, Marcus replied, but proving they were behind the arson will be challenging without direct evidence. Let me do some research and see what our options are. While Marcus worked on the legal strategy, I focused on salvaging what I could of my farm operation. The community rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. Neighboring farmers offered equipment loans. The local feed store gave me credit for replacements for my lost chickens. Even residents from the groves itself, people who clearly didn't share their HOA board's views, stopped by with offers of help. One such resident, Eleanor Patel, approached me about 2 weeks after the fire. I live in the groves, she said hesitantly, but I want you to know not everyone there supports what the board is doing. Some of us moved here because we wanted to be near farmland, not to eliminate it. Eleanor shared that there had been heated discussions at HOA meetings about my property, with Deborah and a small group of board members pushing aggressive action while many residents objected. Deborah keeps saying you're lowering our property values, but many of us believe the opposite. That having an organic farm nearby actually makes our community more desirable. This information gave me hope that the entire community wasn't against me. Eleanor promised to keep her ears open and let me know of any relevant developments within the HOA. A month after the fire, Marcus called with news. Jackson, I think we've found something significant. The HOA has been operating outside their charter in several ways. They've been using association funds for purposes not authorized by their bylaws, including hiring private investigators to monitor properties outside their jurisdiction, specifically yours. How did you discover this? I asked. A whistleblower from their accounting department contacted me after seeing our cease and desist letter. She's provided financial records showing expenditures authorized by Deborah for surveillance of your property, consultations with attorneys about forcing annexation of your land, and most damning of all, a $5,000 cash withdrawal the day before. Your barn burned down. This was the break we needed. With this evidence, Marcus filed a civil suit against the Groves at Pinewood HOA and Deborah Winters personally, seeking $500,000 in damages for harassment, defamation, interference with business operations, and conspiracy. While we couldn't directly prove their involvement in the arson, the circumstantial evidence was compelling. Filing the lawsuit was just the beginning of what would become a lengthy and complex legal battle. But for the first time since Deborah Winters had pulled into my driveway months ago, I felt like I was taking back control. The HOA had tried to bully me off my land, but they were about to learn that this farmer wasn't backing down. Filing the lawsuit against the Groves HOA and Deborah Winters personally sent shockwaves through the community. The local newspaper ran a front-page story detailing my allegations, complete with photos of my burned-down barn and copies of the harassment letters from the HOA. Overnight, my private battle became very public. The reaction was swift. The day after the story broke, I received a call from Detective Rivera of the County Sheriff's Department. Mr. Miller, we're reopening the investigation into the fire at your property, he said. Some new information has come to light that we need to look into more thoroughly. He wouldn't tell me exactly what had prompted this renewed interest, but I suspected that the lawsuit and accompanying publicity had made it harder for them to ignore the case. Within hours of the newspaper hitting doorsteps, my phone started ringing non-stop. Local residents, other farmers who'd had run-ins with expanding suburban developments, and even a few anonymous individuals claiming to be Groves residents offered support and information. One call particularly stood out. Mr. Miller? A nervous voice asked when I picked up. My name is Trevor Davenport. I work for Atlantic Security Services. We were hired by Ms. Winters several months ago to conduct surveillance on your property. I need to talk to you about some things I witnessed. I immediately contacted Marcus and arranged for Trevor to meet us at his office that afternoon. The security guard looked uncomfortable as he settled into a chair across from us, constantly glancing at the door as if worried someone might burst in. I could lose my job for this, he began, but after seeing that fire, I can't stay quiet anymore. Trevor explained that Deborah had initially hired Atlantic Security to document code violations on my property, a service they regularly provided to HOAs dealing with non-compliant homeowners. But this was different, he said. You weren't even in their jurisdiction, and Ms. Winters' instructions kept changing, becoming more aggressive. He described how she had first asked them to document my daily routine, identifying times when the property was unattended. Then she requested they check for security systems and catalog all valuable equipment. Finally, just a week before the fire, she had asked if their firm could create documentation of nuisance conditions, essentially fabricate evidence of violations. Our company refused that request, Trevor said. My supervisor told her we only document actual conditions. We don't create them. She was furious. That's when she terminated our contract. Did she say anything that directly linked her to the fire? Marcus asked. Trevor shook his head. Nothing explicit. But the last thing she said to my supervisor was, if you won't help solve this problem, I'll find someone who will. 3 days later, I heard about the fire on the news. While Trevor's testimony didn't prove Deborah had ordered the arson, it established a clear pattern of escalating actions against me and demonstrated her willingness to cross ethical lines. Marcus asked him to sign an affidavit detailing everything. He told us, which Trevor did, though his hand shook as he picked up the pen. I hope nothing happens to you because of this, I said as he prepared to leave. He gave a grim smile. I already quit Atlantic. I've got a job lined up with my brother-in-law's construction company. Some things are more important than a paycheck. Armed with Trevor's affidavit, Marcus amended our lawsuit to include additional claims of invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He also forwarded the information to Detective Rivera, who assured us it would be incorporated into the ongoing arson investigation. The HOA's initial response to our lawsuit came through their attorney, Philip Greenway, a slick corporate lawyer from a prestigious firm in the nearest big city. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property and therefore could not be held liable for any attempts to regulate it, essentially admitting they had no authority while simultaneously trying to use that fact as a shield. It's almost comical, Marcus said when he showed me their filing. They're basically saying, yes, we harassed him about property regulations, but since we had no right to regulate his property in the first place, the harassment doesn't count. Ooh, the judge didn't buy it either. She denied their motion to dismiss, allowing our case to proceed to discovery, the phase where both sides could request documents and testimony from the other. This was exactly what we'd hoped for, as it would give us access to internal HOA communications and financial records that might contain evidence linking them directly to the fire. Meanwhile, the Grove's community itself was in turmoil. Eleanor Patel kept me updated on the internal politics playing out. An emergency HOA meeting had been called to address the lawsuit, and attendance was at an all-time high. Residents were outraged, not at me, but at their board. People are furious about the potential financial liability, Eleanor explained. The HOA insurance won't cover intentional acts like harassment or arson, which means if you win your lawsuit, every homeowner could be assessed thousands of dollars to cover the damages. And that's assuming the criminal investigation doesn't lead to charges, which would be even worse for property values than having a farm next door. Several homeowners had formed a coalition demanding Deborah's resignation, but she refused to step down, insisting that everything she had done was for the good of the community. She portrayed me as an uncooperative outsider, threatening their way of life, and claimed the lawsuit was a shakedown attempt designed to force the HOA to purchase my property at an inflated price. Some residents believed her, but most were skeptical, especially after multiple county inspections had found my farm in full compliance with all applicable regulations. The division created a toxic atmosphere within the neighborhood, with residents taking sides and community events turning into battlegrounds of accusation and counter-accusation. I took no pleasure in seeing the community torn apart, but I wasn't about to back down either. The discovery process was revealing troubling information about how the HOA operated. Financial records showed a pattern of using association funds for questionable purposes, often with minimal documentation. Board meeting minutes revealed discussions about my property that had never been shared with the general membership, including strategies to force me to sell. Most damning of all was an email thread between Deborah and two other board members discussing the need for decisive action after my cease and desist letter. One board member had written, "We need something that will make Miller understand that his farming days are over, something dramatic." Deborah had replied, "Leave it to me. I know someone who can solve problems like this discreetly." When confronted with this evidence during her deposition, Deborah claimed she had been referring to a real estate developer who might make me an offer I couldn't refuse, not anything nefarious. But her nervous demeanor and contradictory statements about the timing of events made her explanation unconvincing. The real breakthrough came 3 months into the case when Detective Rivera called to tell me they had arrested someone for the arson, a 20-year-old named Corey Hansen. Corey was the son of Richard Hansen, one of the HOA board members, who had been most vocal about my farm being a blight on the community. Corey confessed, Rivera told me. He claims he acted alone, wanted to impress his father by solving the farm problem. Says his dad constantly complained about how your property was lowering their home value, but never directly asked him to do anything about it. "Do you believe him?" I asked. Rivera paused. "We're still investigating. The kids' phone records show multiple calls with Deborah Winters in the days leading up to the fire, which he claims were about an HOA youth committee he served on. We're waiting on a warrant for those cell tower records and text messages." When news of Corey's arrest hit the community, the reaction was immediate. Richard Hansen resigned from the board, claiming he had no knowledge of his son's plans and was devastated by his actions. 3 other board members also stepped down, leaving only Deborah and 1 loyalist remaining. An emergency election was held to fill the vacant positions, and Eleanor Patel was among those elected to the new board. Their first official act was to vote to remove Deborah as president, though she remained on the board due to procedural rules, requiring a general membership vote for complete removal. The new board reached out to Marcus about the possibility of settling our lawsuit. They proposed a payment of $250,000 to cover my damages, along with a formal apology and a legally binding agreement to never attempt to impose HOA regulations on my property. They also offered to help organize community volunteers to assist in rebuilding my barn. "It's a reasonable offer," Marcus admitted when we discussed it. "The problem is, it doesn't address the criminal aspect. Corey Hansen may have set the fire, but I'm convinced Deborah knew about it beforehand, maybe even suggested it indirectly. If we settle now, the criminal investigation might lose momentum." I agreed. As much as I wanted to put this nightmare behind me, I couldn't accept a settlement that might allow those truly responsible to escape justice. We countered with a demand for the full $500,000, a requirement that Deborah be permanently removed from the board, and a stipulation that the HOA would fully cooperate with the ongoing criminal investigation. While negotiations continued, I focused on rebuilding my farm. The insurance company had finally processed my claim after Corey's arrest confirmed the fire was arson, and I used the proceeds to begin construction on a new, larger barn with improved safety features. Spring was approaching again, and I was determined to get my operation back on track for the growing season. One evening, as I was reviewing plans for the new chicken coop, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I was shocked to find Richard Hansen standing on my porch, looking haggard and much older than when I'd last seen him at the HOA confrontation months earlier. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice barely audible, "I need to talk to you about the fire, about Deborah." I invited him in, my curiosity overcoming my initial anger at seeing the father of the young man who had burned down my barn. Richard sat heavily at my kitchen table, declining my offer of coffee with a shake of his head. "Corey didn't act alone," he said finally, "and he didn't do it to impress me. He did it because Deborah paid him $5,000. My blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "This, because I found the cash in his room after his arrest. When I confronted him, he broke down and told me everything. Deborah approached him, not the other way around. She knew he had trouble with the law before, minor stuff, vandalism, some pot possession, and she used that to manipulate him. Told him it would just be a warning fire to scare you off, nothing major." Richard's hands were shaking. "I've already told the police everything. Corey's working with them now, agreed to testify against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. I know this doesn't make up for what happened to your property, but I wanted you to hear it from me directly. I'm so sorry for what my son did, and for my part in creating the environment where Deborah's vendetta against you could flourish." The conversation with Richard marked a turning point in the case. With Corey cooperating with the investigation and providing text messages where Deborah had explicitly requested the warning fire, the district attorney filed criminal charges against her for conspiracy to commit arson, a felony carrying up to 15 years in prison. Deborah was arrested the following morning as she attempted to board a flight to Arizona. A search of her home revealed documents suggesting she had been planning to liquidate her assets and relocate permanently, indicating she had gotten wind of Corey's cooperation with the police. With Deborah facing criminal charges, the HOA's new board approached us again about settling the civil lawsuit. This time, they agreed to all our demands: the full $500,000 in damages, permanent removal of Deborah from any HOA position, a legal agreement respecting my property rights, and full cooperation with the criminal prosecution. "I think you should take it," Marcus advised. "The criminal case against Deborah is solid, and this settlement accomplishes everything we set out to do with the civil suit. Plus, it allows the community to begin healing and rebuilding relationships with you as a neighbor, rather than continuing this adversarial situation." After careful consideration, I agreed. The settlement was finalized, with the $500,000 payment coming partly from the HOA's reserve fund and partly from a special assessment on homeowners. Some residents grumbled about having to pay for Deborah's actions, but most understood it was the price of moving forward. True to their word, the new board organized weekend volunteer groups to help with rebuilding efforts on my farm. It was surreal to see people from the groves, folks who months earlier might have been complaining about my eyesore property, now showing up with tools and lumber, working alongside me to reconstruct what their former leader had destroyed. Eleanor Patel, now the new HOA president, became a regular visitor, often bringing homemade food for the volunteer crews. "We're trying to build a different kind of relationship with our neighbors," she explained one day as we watched a team raising the frame for my new barn. The old board saw anything different as a threat. We're learning to see diversity, including agricultural uses, as something that makes our community stronger and more interesting. Deborah's criminal trial began 6 months after her arrest. I testified about the escalating harassment campaign, the threatening confrontations, and the devastating impact of the fire. Corey Hansen testified about Deborah's explicit instructions to set a small fire that would frighten me into selling, and how she had provided specific details about when the property would be unoccupied and which part of the barn would burn fastest. The evidence was overwhelming. After a 2-week trial, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Deborah guilty on all counts. The judge, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and Deborah's abuse of her position of authority, sentenced her to 12 years in prison. As for Corey, his cooperation earned him a reduced sentence of 2 years in a minimum security facility, plus 5 years of probation and mandatory community service. Part of his plea agreement included helping to rebuild my barn and other structures that had been damaged in the fire, a form of restorative justice that gave him the chance to literally rebuild what he had destroyed. Richard Hansen sold his house in the Groves and moved away shortly after the trial, unable to face the community where his son's actions and his own complicity through inaction had caused so much harm. Before leaving, he made a substantial anonymous donation to a local agriculture education program I had started on my farm, teaching local school children about sustainable farming practices. As for me, the settlement money allowed me to not only rebuild what I had lost, but to expand my operations. I added a farm store where I could sell produce directly to customers, including many from the Groves who had become supporters after. Learning the full story of what their HOA had done, I installed state-of-the-art irrigation systems, expanded my greenhouse, and hired 2 local teens as part-time help. Most importantly, I worked with a lawyer to create a conservation easement on my property, legally protecting it from development and ensuring it would remain agricultural land in perpetuity. No future HOA would ever be able to force changes to my farm, no matter how the surrounding area developed. The new relationship with the Groves proved mutually beneficial. I started a CSA, community-supported agriculture program, with many residents becoming subscribers who received weekly boxes of fresh produce. The HOA incorporated regular farm tours and seasonal harvest festivals into their community events calendar. Some residents even volunteered their time on the farm, finding that working the soil provided a welcome respite from their desk jobs and suburban routines. Eleanor and the new board went even further, revising the HOA bylaws to explicitly recognize the value of agricultural neighbors and prohibiting any future board from attempting to extend their jurisdiction beyond the legal boundaries of the development. They also created a neighborhood relations committee focused on building positive connections with all adjacent property owners, rather than trying to control them. 1 year after the settlement, as we celebrated the completion of the new barn, with a community picnic attended by people from both my rural neighborhood and the Groves, Eleanor pulled me aside. "You know," she said, "in a weird way, we should almost thank Deborah. If she hadn't gone to such extreme lengths to try to force you out, we might never have realized how toxic our community had become. Her actions were inexcusable, but they forced us to confront the culture of entitlement and control that had taken root here." I had to agree. Out of the ashes of my barn had risen not just new structures, but a new kind of relationship between urban and rural neighbors, one based on mutual respect and appreciation rather than control and conformity. The experience changed me too. I became an advocate for property rights and responsible development, speaking at county commission meetings and advising other farmers facing pressure from expanding suburbs. I worked with local officials to strengthen protections for agricultural land and create buffer zones between farms and new developments, ensuring that both could coexist without friction. Looking back, I realized that what had started as a nightmare, an HOA setting my farm on fire when I declined their membership and the subsequent $500,000 lawsuit, had ultimately led to something positive. It had forced a reckoning within the community about values, priorities, and the true meaning of being good neighbors. As the sun set over my flourishing fields and the sounds of laughter drifted from the picnic tables where former adversaries now broke bread together, I thought about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to unexpected transformations. The fire that was meant to drive me away had instead forged stronger bonds between me and my community, proving that even the darkest situations can sometimes lead to the brightest outcomes. 7 years had passed since the fire that changed everything. My farm had not only recovered but thrived, becoming something of a local landmark. The relationship with the Groves community had evolved into a mutually beneficial partnership that many pointed to as a model for suburban-rural cooperation. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm that I never could have imagined during those tumultuous early days. Then came the phone call that would disrupt that peace and open yet another chapter in this seemingly endless saga. Mr. Miller, this is Warden Petrovich from Clearwater State Correctional Facility. I'm calling about Deborah Winters. My grip tightened on the phone. Despite our brief correspondence years earlier, I hadn't given much thought to Deborah recently. She still had several years left on her sentence, and I had made peace with that chapter of my life. What about her? I asked, a feeling of unease settling in my stomach. Ms. Winters has been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Her doctors give her 3 to 6 months. She's requested compassionate release to spend her remaining time with family, and as part of that process, we're required to notify victims of the crime. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, unsure how to process this information. The woman who had orchestrated the destruction of my property, who had caused me months of fear and stress, was dying. And now, in some way, her fate was partially in my hands. Do you need my approval for her release? I asked. Not exactly, the warden explained, but the parole board will consider victim statements in their decision. You have the right to submit one, or appear at the hearing if you wish. I promised to think about it and hung up, my mind racing. What was the right thing to do? Part of me felt Deborah deserved to serve her full sentence regardless of her health. She hadn't shown mercy when she orchestrated the burning of my barn, potentially endangering not just my property but my life. Why should she receive mercy now? But another part of me remembered her letter, the apparent remorse she had expressed. The reports from Eleanor about her efforts to reform herself in prison. And beyond that, what would opposing her release accomplish? Would it bring back my original barn or erase the trauma of those difficult months? I decided to consult with Eleanor before making a decision. Over the years, she had become a trusted friend and advisor, someone whose judgment I respected. We met at the small cafe that had opened at the entrance to the Groves, a business that sourced much of its produce from my farm and had become a gathering place for both rural and suburban residents. I heard about Deborah, Eleanor said as soon as we sat down. News travels fast in our network. What do you think I should do? I asked, stirring my coffee absently. Eleanor considered the question carefully. You know, when all this first happened, I was as angry as anyone. What she did was inexcusable, and her punishment was deserved. But now... She paused, looking out the window toward the community she had helped transform. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes a community work. It's not just rules and standards. It's forgiveness, second chances, recognizing our common humanity even when it's difficult. You think I should support her release, I said, reading between the lines. I think whatever you decide will be the right choice for you, Eleanor replied. But I also think that the man I've come to know over these past 7 years is someone who understands that healing sometimes requires letting go of justified anger. I mulled over her words as I drove back to my farm. The late afternoon sun illuminated the fields where my crops grew in neat rows, the rebuilt barn that now housed not just equipment but educational displays for the school groups that visited. Regularly, the small farm store where local residents purchased fresh produce and handmade goods. All of this had risen from the ashes of what Deborah had tried to destroy. Perhaps that was the most powerful statement I could make. Not opposing her release, but showing her that her attempts to drive me away had ultimately failed, that something beautiful and community-oriented had emerged from her destructive actions. The next day, I called Warden Petrovich and informed him that I would not oppose Deborah's compassionate release. Furthermore, I would submit a statement to the parole board expressing my belief that allowing her to spend her final months with family was the humane choice. I made it clear that I wasn't minimizing what she had done, but rather acknowledging that continued incarceration of a terminally ill woman served no productive purpose. What I didn't expect was the response from the community when word of my decisions spread. The Grove's residents, many of whom had been directly impacted by the special assessment to pay the settlement, were divided. Some praised my compassion, seeing it as consistent with the values of cooperation and mutual respect that had developed between the farm and the neighborhood. Others were outraged, feeling that Deborah deserved no mercy after the harm she had caused. The debate played out in community meetings, local social media groups, and even in the regional newspaper, which ran an article about the case and my decision not to oppose the release. I tried to stay above the fray, focusing on my farm work and the educational programs that now took up a significant portion of my time, but it was impossible to ignore the renewed attention being directed my way. 3 weeks after my conversation with the warden, I received notification that Deborah's compassionate release had been approved. She would be released into the custody of her sister, who lived in a neighboring state, where she would receive hospice care for her remaining time. I thought that would be the end of it. Deborah would live out her final months far from here, and eventually the controversy would fade. But once again, this story had unexpected turns in store. A week after Deborah's release, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was a long pause before a weak voice spoke. "Jackson, this is Deborah Winters." I nearly dropped the phone in shock. Of all the people I might have expected to hear from, she was at the bottom of the list. "How did you get my number?" I asked, unsure what else to say. "Eleanor gave it to me," she replied, her voice thin but determined. "I hope that's okay. I wouldn't have called, but there's something I need to tell you, and I don't have much time." I sank into a chair, wondering what possible unfinished business could remain between us. "I'm listening," I said finally. "First, I want to thank you for not opposing my release. The warden told me about your statement to the parole board. It was more than I deserved." She paused, and I could hear her labored breathing. "But that's not why I'm calling. There's something you don't know about the fire, something that never came out during the trial." A chill ran through me. What else could there be that I didn't already know? "I didn't just target your farm because it was an eyesore or threatened property values," Deborah continued. "There was another reason, one I've never told anyone. Your land. It used to belong to my family." I was stunned into silence. This was something I had never heard. Not during the property purchase, not during the legal proceedings, not in any of the community discussions about the conflict. "My grandfather owned that parcel until the 1980s, Deborah explained. "It was part of a larger tract that had been in our family for generations. He was forced to sell it during the farm crisis when interest rates skyrocketed. It broke his heart, and he never recovered from losing that connection to the land. He passed away a few months after the sale, and my father always believed the stress of losing the farm contributed to his death. I struggled to process this new information. But why not just tell me this? Why resort to harassment and ultimately arson? Deborah's laugh was bitter and ended in a cough. Pride, I suppose, and twisted logic. When I moved to the Groves, I had no idea the development bordered my grandfather's old property, but once I realized it, I became obsessed with the idea of somehow reclaiming it. Not for farming, I never had his love of the land, but as a kind of justice for what our family had lost. When you bought it and started turning it back into a working farm, it felt like a personal insult, like you were succeeding where my family had failed. The revelation cast our entire conflict in a new and more complex light. What I had interpreted as simple entitlement and suburban encroachment had actually been rooted in a much more personal grief and misplaced sense of ownership. "I'm not telling you this to excuse what I did," Deborah continued. "Nothing justifies that. But before I die, I wanted you to know the full truth, and to tell you that seeing how you've nurtured that land, made it productive again, connected it to the community. My grandfather would have approved, even if I couldn't see that at the time." We talked for nearly an hour, Deborah sharing memories of visiting the farm as a child, helping her grandfather with simple chores, learning the names of plants and animals that had long since disappeared from the property by the time I acquired it. Despite myself, I found the conversation moving, a window into the history of my land that I had never had access to before. Before we ended the call, Deborah made an unexpected request. "My sister has agreed to drive me out there next week. I'd like to see the old place one last time if you're willing. I understand completely if you say no." I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face Deborah in person after all this time. But curiosity about the land's history, combined with a sense that this final meeting might provide closure for both of us, led me to agree. The day of Deborah's visit arrived with a perfect early autumn crispness in the air. I had spent the previous evening reviewing old property records, confirming her story about her grandfather's ownership. I found the deed transfer from 1983, signed by Harold Winters, selling to a land development company that had eventually parceled off the section I now owned. I was working in the greenhouse when a sedan pulled up my driveway. A middle-aged woman I didn't recognize, presumably Deborah's sister, got out and opened the passenger door, helping a frail figure into a wheelchair. The woman I saw bore little resemblance to the imperious HOA president who had once threatened me with destruction. Cancer and imprisonment had taken their toll, leaving Deborah gaunt and aged far beyond her years. I approached them, feeling a complex mix of emotions, residual anger, unexpected compassion, and a strange sense of things coming full circle. "Mr. Miller," Deborah said, extending a thin hand. "Thank you for allowing this. Please, call me Jackson," I replied, shaking her hand gently. "And you must be Caroline," I added, turning to her sister, who nodded with a guarded smile. "Would you like a tour of the property?" I offered, gesturing to the wheelchair-accessible paths I had installed for educational tours. For the next hour, I showed them around the farm, describing the sustainable practices I had implemented, the educational programs we ran, and the partnership with the Groves that had developed over the years. Deborah remained mostly silent, her eyes taking in everything with an intensity that suggested she was overlaying her childhood memories on the current reality. When we reached the old oak tree at the far end of the property, the one feature that had remained constant through all the changes of ownership and use, Deborah asked if we could stop for a while. "My grandfather used to string a swing from that branch," she said, pointing with a shaking finger. "I would spend hours out, here swinging and watching him work the fields." As she shared more memories, I began to see the land through her eyes, not just as my property, but as a place layered with generations of history, of attachment and loss, of dreams fulfilled and broken. The realization humbled me. For all my talk of being the rightful owner, standing up to HOA overreach, I was just the latest in a long line of caretakers for this piece of earth. "I brought something for you," Deborah said, as our tour concluded. She nodded to Caroline, who retrieved a worn leather photo album from their car. "These are pictures of the farm from my grandfather's time. I thought you might like to have them to understand what this place used to be." I was touched by the gesture, recognizing it as a kind of passing of the torch, an acknowledgement that while the land had once been her family's, it was now my responsibility to steward it. We sat on the farmhouse porch, paging through black and white photos of fields being plowed by horses, a much younger version of the oak tree, a modest farmhouse that had been replaced by mine, and a smiling man who must have been Harold Winters, Deborah's grandfather. "He grew mostly corn and soybeans," Deborah explained, "but he always kept a big vegetable garden too, like you do, and chickens. He said no real farm was complete without chickens scratching around the yard." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself sharing my own plans for the property's future, the expanded educational center I hoped to build, the apprenticeship program for new farmers I was developing, the conservation easement that would ensure the land remained agricultural in perpetuity. "It will never be developed then?" Deborah asked, a note of relief in her voice. "Never," I assured her. "Even if I sell someday, the easement stays with the land. It will always be a farm." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That would have meant everything to my grandfather, and it means a lot to me, knowing that his land won't disappear under more houses like—" She gestured toward the groves in the distance. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She had once been determined to extend suburban development onto my farm, and now she was expressing gratitude that it would remain agricultural forever. As they prepared to leave, Deborah asked for a moment alone with me. Caroline walked toward the car, leaving us on the porch. "I know an apology doesn't begin to cover what I did," Deborah said, her voice stronger than it had been all afternoon. "But I am truly sorry, not just for the fire, but for all of it. The harassment, the threats, the manipulation of Corey. I let bitterness consume me, and I caused harm that can never be fully repaired." "The barn was rebuilt," I said simply. "The farm recovered. In some ways, it's stronger now than it would have been without that challenge." "That's generous of you to say." She looked out over the fields, golden in the late afternoon sun. "Do you think there's such a thing as redemption, Jackson? Real redemption, not just saying the right words or serving time?" The question caught me off guard. Who was I to speak of redemption or forgiveness? And yet, looking at this dying woman, who had once been my worst enemy, I found myself wanting to offer some comfort, some assurance that her final acts of truth-telling and reconciliation mattered. "I think redemption is in the trying," I said after a moment. "In acknowledging the wrong and working to set it right, even when that's not fully possible. In being honest about the past while trying to create a different future." Deborah nodded, tears in her eyes. "Then I hope these last conversations, this visit, I hope they're a step in that direction. Not to erase what I did, but to end things differently than they began." As Caroline helped her back into the car, Deborah turned to me one last time. "Take good care of this place, Jackson. It deserves someone who loves it." I watched their car disappear down the driveway, the dust settling in its wake, feeling as though a complex chapter in both our lives had found its conclusion. Not a neat storybook ending, but something messier and more human. A recognition of harm done and partial amends made, of history acknowledged and new possibilities embraced. 2 months later, I received a brief call from Caroline informing me that Deborah had passed away. There would be a small private service, and no, I wasn't expected to attend, but she thought I would want to know. After hanging up, I walked out to the old oak tree and stood beneath its spreading branches, thinking about Harold Winters and his granddaughter, about loss and attachment, about how land can shape people's lives in ways that echo across generations. On impulse, I decided to honor that history in a tangible way. The following spring, I installed a simple wooden swing from the same branch Deborah had mentioned, not as a memorial to her specifically, but as an acknowledgement of the land's continuous story, of which I was just a current chapter. When school groups visited, I began sharing not just the sustainable farming techniques we practiced, but also the human history of the property, including the conflict with the HOA and the unexpected reconciliation that had followed. Eleanor helped me organize a community history project, collecting stories and photographs from longtime residents about how the area had changed over the decades, the transition from primarily agricultural to increasingly suburban, the tensions and collaborations that had emerged along the way. Deborah's photo album became part of this archive, her grandfather's stewardship of the land recognized alongside others who had shaped the region. In a development I never could have anticipated, Caroline contacted me a year after Deborah's death with a surprising proposition. She had inherited a small trust from her sister, with instructions to use it for a purpose related to agricultural preservation. After much thought, she wanted to donate it to fund a scholarship for young farmers training at my farm. Deborah specified that the money should go toward helping the next generation learn traditional farming skills, Caroline explained. She said her grandfather would have wanted his legacy to continue that way, even if it couldn't be through family. The Harold Winters Agricultural Scholarship became a reality the following year, providing funding for 3 apprentices annually to live and work on the farm, learning both practical skills and the business aspects of sustainable agriculture. The first recipients included a former accountant seeking a career change, a recent environmental science graduate, and, in a twist that still amazes me, Corey Hansen. Yes, the young man who had once set fire to my barn applied to the program after completing his parole and working for several years in environmental restoration. His application was forthright about our history, acknowledging his crime and explaining how it had ultimately led him to develop a deep interest in healing damaged landscapes. After much deliberation, I decided to accept him, believing that if this farm had become a place of reconciliation, that should extend to him as well. Corey proved to be one of the most dedicated apprentices we ever had, approaching the work with a humility and conscientiousness that spoke to his genuine desire for redemption. He never expected forgiveness or special treatment, instead letting his actions demonstrate his changed perspective. After completing the program, he established his own small farm, focusing on native plant restoration and habitat creation, becoming an advocate for conservation easements like the one protecting my property. 10 years after the fire, the landscape, both physical and social, had transformed in ways none of us could have predicted. The farm thrived. Its connection to the groves had become a selling point for the community rather than a source of conflict, and the educational programs reached hundreds of people annually. The legal battle and arson that had once defined my relationship with the area had evolved into something far more complex and ultimately more rewarding. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Deborah had simply approached me honestly in those early days, sharing her family's connection to the land and her grief over its loss. Would we have found common ground? Might she have become an ally in preserving the agricultural character of the property rather than trying to erase it? It's impossible to know, of course, but the question reminds me how often conflict arises not from simple malice, but from unspoken pain, from stories we don't know and histories we haven't heard. As I swing gently beneath the old oak tree, watching a new generation of apprentices tend the fields her grandfather once farmed, I reflect on the strange journey that brought us here. A journey that began with fire and a $500,000 lawsuit has ended with scholarships and reconciliation, with a community that has learned to value its agricultural heritage alongside its suburban present. The HOA that once tried to set my farm on fire when I declined their membership has transformed into an organization that celebrates its connection to the land, that recognizes the value of diversity in landscape and lifestyle, that understands community is built through cooperation rather than control. And I, the farmer who once just wanted to be left alone, have found that the most meaningful harvest has been the relationships cultivated alongside the crops. Sometimes the most bitter conflicts contain the seeds of the most profound reconciliations. Sometimes the fire that threatens to destroy everything instead clears the ground for new growth. And sometimes, when we're willing to look beyond our initial assumptions and listen to the deeper stories beneath the surface, we discover that those we considered enemies are complex humans carrying their own burdens of history and loss, capable of both terrible harm and meaningful redemption. This land will continue its story long after I'm gone, just as it continued after Harold Winters was forced to sell and after Deborah tried to reclaim it through destruction. My hope is that the legacy we've built here, of resilience, of community, connection, of honoring the past while creating a sustainable future, will remain as firmly rooted as the old oak tree that has witnessed it all, offering shade and support to whoever comes next in the ongoing story of this place we all, in our different ways, have called home. 15 years had passed since the fire that had nearly destroyed my farm. What had begun as a simple dream of agricultural independence had evolved into something far more significant. A thriving organic operation, an educational center, and a model for community integration. The Harold Winters Agricultural Scholarship program had trained dozens of new farmers who had gone on to establish their own operations throughout the region. The annual Harvest Festival now drew thousands of visitors from across the state, and the relationship with the groves had become so symbiotic that new developments in the area were actively seeking to replicate our model of suburban-rural cooperation. But success brings its own challenges. As my farm's profile grew, so did the pressures and responsibilities. What had once been a one-man operation now employed 15 full-time staff members, hosted hundreds of visitors weekly, and supplied produce to restaurants and markets throughout the region. The quiet life I had initially sought had been replaced by a constant stream of decisions, meetings, and public engagements. On a crisp autumn morning, as I sat in my office reviewing applications for the next year's scholarship program, my assistant Kate poked her head through the door. "Jackson, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important, but won't give her name." Now, curious, I followed Kate to the reception area of our recently expanded education center. A woman in her early 30s stood examining the historical display we had created about the farm's past, including the photos Deborah had given me of her grandfather's time on the land. "Mr. Miller," she said, turning as I entered. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. My name is Alexis Winters." The surname hit me like a physical blow. "Winters, are you related to—" "Deborah was my aunt," she confirmed, "and Harold was my great-grandfather." I invited her to my office, mind racing with questions about why another member of the Winters family had appeared at my farm after all these years. As we settled into chairs, I noticed she carried a leather portfolio similar to the one that had contained Harold's photos. "I apologize for dropping in unannounced," Alexis began. "I've actually been following your work for—" Years, but I wasn't sure how you'd react to hearing from another Winters after everything my aunt put you through. What can I do for you, Ms. Winters? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She opened the portfolio and removed a stack of documents. I'm an environmental lawyer specializing in agricultural land protection. I've been working with family farms, facing development pressure, and your story has been something of a case study in my work, but that's not why I'm here today. She slid a document across the desk to me, a survey map of the surrounding area with property boundaries marked in different colors. The county has approved a major development project that will impact this entire region. Riverstone Development Group has purchased over 2,000 acres surrounding the groves, including all the farmland that borders your property to the north and east. I studied the map with growing concern. The parcels she indicated represented the last significant agricultural land in the area besides my farm. What are they planning? A mixed-use development they're calling Riverstone Commons, shopping centers, luxury housing, an office park, and a golf course. She pointed to areas on the map. Construction is scheduled to begin in 6 months. The implications were immediate and alarming. Such extensive development would dramatically alter the character of the entire area, potentially threatening the water table that my organic operation relied upon, increasing traffic past my farm to unmanageable levels, and destroying the buffer of open space that had protected my agricultural practices from conflicts with suburban neighbors. "Why are you bringing this to me?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect her motives. Alexis met my gaze directly. "Because you've been here before. You fought a similar battle, albeit on a smaller scale, and won. The coalition I'm working with, local farmers, environmental groups, some forward-thinking residents from the groves, we need someone with your experience and public profile to help lead the opposition to this project." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of what she was asking. "Ms. Winters, I appreciate your concern, but I've had my fill of land use battles. My farm is protected by a conservation easement. Whatever Riverstone builds won't affect my legal right to operate." "It won't affect your legal right," she agreed, "but it will affect your practical ability to farm. Imagine trying to move equipment when the roads are clogged with commuter traffic. Think about complaints about agricultural smells and sounds, coming from thousands of new residents who moved in without understanding what it means to live near a working farm. Consider what will happen to your water supply when they're irrigating hundreds of acres of golf course." Her point struck home. While I had secured my property's agricultural status, I hadn't considered how radically the surrounding context could change, potentially making farming here untenable despite my legal protections. "There's something else you should know," Alexis added, pulling another document from her portfolio. "The president of Riverstone Development Group is Thomas Bradley." The name initially meant nothing to me, but then recognition dawned. "Any relation to William Bradley?" She nodded grimly. "His son. William Bradley was the developer who originally built the groves and tried to pressure your neighbor into selling years ago. Now his son is finishing what he started, consuming all the remaining agricultural land in the valley." The connection brought the threat into sharper focus. William Bradley had been a silent force behind many of the region's developments, including indirectly supporting the previous HOA board's aggressive tactics. His company had donated generously to local politicians who consistently voted against agricultural protections. If his son was leading this new development push, it suggested a coordinated long-term strategy to transform the entire area. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I asked Alexis. "Join our coalition formally. Speak at the upcoming county commission meetings. Let us leverage your story and reputation to show how valuable the agricultural character of this region is, both economically and culturally." She paused. And there's one more thing, though I hesitate to ask it. Go on, I prompted. We need access to your visitor and customer data, not personal information, just aggregate numbers demonstrating the economic impact of agricultural tourism in the region. Your farm is the prime example. But if we could show the commissioners that farming isn't just about crop yields, but also about bringing thousands of visitors to the area annually, spending money at local businesses. I considered her request. The farm's databases did indeed contain valuable information about our economic footprint, not just direct sales, but the broader impact of our educational programs, festivals, and farm-to-table partnerships with local restaurants. This kind of data could be powerful in demonstrating that preserving agricultural land made financial sense for the county, not just environmental or cultural sense. I need time to think about this, I told her. Getting involved in another land use battle isn't something I can decide impulsively. Alexis seemed to have anticipated this response. She handed me a thumb drive. Here's all our research on the development proposal, environmental impact assessments, and legal analyses. There's also information about our coalition members. Take your time, review it, and let me know what you decide. After she left, I sat for a long while looking at the farm that had become not just my livelihood, but my legacy. Through the window, I could see apprentices working in the fields, a school group touring the educational center, delivery trucks loading produce for local restaurants. All of this could be threatened by a development that would fundamentally alter the character of the entire region. That evening, I called Eleanor Patel, who remained a trusted advisor even after stepping down as HOA president several years earlier. Now in her 70s, she had become a respected voice on sustainable community development and served on several regional planning committees. I've heard rumors about Riverstone Commons, she confirmed after I explained Alexis's visit. The official plans haven't been presented to the public yet, but there have been closed-door meetings with certain county officials. It's big, Jackson, much bigger than anything we've seen before in this area. Do you think opposition has any chance of success? I asked, valuing her political savvy. Eleanor sighed. Honestly, it's an uphill battle. The county has been gradually weakening agricultural protections for years, and Riverstone has deep pockets for both legal battles and political contributions. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Some of the commissioners are concerned about water usage and traffic impacts. If public opposition is strong enough and well organized, there's a chance to at least modify the proposal significantly. After our call, I spent hours reviewing the materials Alexis had provided. The scale of the proposed development was even more alarming than she had indicated. Riverstone Commons would essentially create a small city around my farm, with estimated population growth that would triple the number of residents in the valley within 5 years. The environmental impact assessment, while technically meeting legal requirements, glossed over serious concerns about watershed protection, wildlife corridors, and the loss of productive agricultural land. Most troubling was a section about buffer zones between the development and existing agricultural operations. The proposed buffers were minimal, essentially ensuring that future residents would be living close enough to working farms to experience the sounds, smells, and activities that inevitably accompany agriculture. This seemed designed to create exactly the kind of conflicts that would eventually pressure remaining farmers to sell. By morning, I had made my decision. I contacted Alexis and agreed to join the coalition opposing Riverstone Commons. Within days, I found myself immersed in a new battle for the future of the land I had fought so hard to protect 15 years earlier. The coalition, which called itself Valley Agricultural Preservation, VAP, was an impressive collection of Stakeholders. Besides the remaining local farmers, it included environmental scientists from the state university, business owners who benefited from agricultural tourism, residents from the groves who valued the mixed rural-suburban character of the area, and even a few former county officials concerned about the pace and scale of development. My first public appearance with the group came at a community forum hosted at the local high school. The auditorium was packed with concerned residents, with clear divisions between those who welcomed the economic opportunities promised by Riverstone and those who feared the loss of the region's agricultural heritage. Thomas Bradley was there, presenting a slick multimedia showcase of Riverstone Commons. At 40, he had his father's commanding presence and polished delivery, describing the development as progress that respects tradition and a model of 21st century community planning. He showcased renderings of tree-lined streets, energy-efficient homes, and commercial areas designed to evoke small-town charm while offering modern conveniences. When it was my turn to speak, I took a different approach. Rather than directly attacking the proposal, I shared the story of my farm's evolution from a solitary operation to a community centerpiece. I presented data showing the economic impact of agricultural tourism in the region, over 50,000 visitors annually to my farm alone, with estimated local spending exceeding $3 million per year. I explained how the development would threaten the water resources that sustainable farming operations depended on, and how the proximity of new housing would create inevitable conflicts with normal agricultural practices. 15 years ago, I concluded, I faced a smaller version of this same battle. An HOA believed that my farm had no place next to their suburban development. They were willing to destroy what they couldn't control. What followed taught all of us that agriculture and residential communities can coexist, but only with meaningful buffers, mutual respect, and recognition that farmland is not just empty space waiting for development. It is productive, valuable, and essential to our regional identity. The audience response was mixed, but passionate. The forum continued late into the evening, with residents expressing both support and opposition to Riverstone Commons. What became clear was that the community was deeply engaged with the issue, unwilling to simply accept whatever the developers and county officials decided behind closed doors. In the weeks that followed, the battle intensified. Riverstone accelerated their timeline, submitting formal applications for rezoning the agricultural parcels they had acquired. VP responded by challenging the environmental impact assessments and organizing a series of public actions. Farm tours highlighting what would be lost, informational sessions about watershed protection, and demonstrations at county commission meetings. My involvement brought both advantages and complications. My story resonated with people who remembered the HOA conflict, and my farm's success provided a powerful example of agriculture's value. But Riverstone's PR team quickly began portraying me as an elitist who had secured his own property, but now wanted to prevent others from developing theirs. A NIMBY, not in my backyard activist who had gotten his piece of the pie and now wanted to deny economic opportunity to others. The pressure took its toll. Farm operations suffered as I devoted more time to coalition activities. Some longtime customers expressed concern about my political stance, and a few local businesses that stood to benefit from the development stopped carrying my produce. Social media erupted with debates about property rights versus community character, with my farm often at the center of the conversation. 3 months into the campaign, Alexis arranged a meeting that took me by surprise. Thomas Bradley wants to meet with you privately, she informed me. Just the two of you, no lawyers, no press. Why would I agree to that? I asked, suspicious of the developer's motives. because he's indicated he might be willing to modify certain aspects of the proposal based on our concerns, and frankly, we need to explore every avenue. The Commission vote is leaning toward approval despite our efforts. Reluctantly, I agreed to the meeting, which was set for the following evening at a neutral location, a conference room at the county library. When I arrived, Thomas Bradley was already there, reviewing documents at the table. "Mr. Miller," he said, rising to shake my hand, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I followed your story for many years, even before this current disagreement." "Mr. Bradley," I acknowledged, taking a seat across from him, "what did you want to discuss?" He slid a folder across the table. "A revised proposal for Riverstone Commons. We've made several modifications based on concerns raised by your coalition." I opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. The changes were substantial. Larger buffer zones between development and existing farms, a 30% reduction in the golf course size with corresponding water usage decreases, preservation of certain view sheds that contributed to the area's rural character, and a commitment to incorporate agricultural elements into the development itself, including community gardens and a permanent farmers market facility. "These are significant concessions," I admitted, looking up from the papers. "They are," Bradley agreed. "They'll cost us millions in reduced housing density and amenity modifications, but we believe they represent a reasonable compromise that addresses the core concerns while still allowing the development to proceed." I studied him, trying to discern his true motives. Why offer this now? And why to me directly, rather than to the coalition or the county commission? Bradley leaned back in his chair. "Because unlike many of your coalition partners, you're not categorically opposed to development. You've demonstrated through your work with the Groves that you understand the value of finding balance, of creating integration rather than opposition between different land uses." His assessment was accurate, which made me even more cautious. "And the private meeting, frankly, because I need to know if these changes would be enough to secure your support or at least neutralize your opposition. Your influence in this debate is significant. If these modifications would satisfy you, I believe we could work out a formal agreement that the rest of the coalition would accept." The revised proposal was tempting. It addressed many of our most serious concerns while acknowledging the reality that some development was inevitable given the parcels Riverstone had already acquired. Supporting it could be framed as a pragmatic compromise rather than a capitulation. But something didn't feel right. "These changes are all within the development itself," I noted. "What about the remaining agricultural parcels in the valley that you haven't acquired yet?" Bradley's expression shifted slightly. "Those aren't part of the current proposal. Our focus is on the land we already control." "But they're part of your long-term strategy," I pressed. "Your father spent decades gradually acquiring and developing this region piece by piece. This is just the current phase of that plan, isn't it?" He didn't deny it. "Business is business, Mr. Miller. We develop properties when market conditions and regulatory environments are favorable. Yes, we have options on additional parcels that may be developed in future phases, but that's not what's before the Commission now." The admission confirmed my suspicions. Riverstone was offering concessions on the current proposal to smooth its approval, but their long-term vision still involved essentially urbanizing the entire valley, one section at a time. The current compromises were tactical, not reflective of any genuine commitment to preserving the area's agricultural character. "I appreciate your honesty," I told him, closing the folder. "And these modifications would certainly improve the current proposal. But I can't support a piecemeal approach that ignores the cumulative impact of your long-term development strategy." Bradley's professional demeanor cooled. "That's disappointing." I had hoped we could find common ground. We might, I suggested, if Riverstone would commit to a comprehensive plan that permanently preserves a certain percentage of agricultural land in the valley, not just modifies how the current parcels are developed. He shook his head. That's not on the table. We can't bind ourselves to restrictions on land we may acquire in the future. Then we remain at an impasse, I concluded, standing to leave. I'll share these proposed modifications with the coalition, but I can't personally endorse a plan that addresses only the symptoms of our concerns, not their cause. As I turned to go, Bradley made one final comment. You know, my father always regretted not acquiring your parcel when he had the chance. He considered your stand against the Grove's HOA to be the first significant setback to our regional vision. I'd hate to see history repeat itself in a more contentious manner. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Are you suggesting that opposing Riverstone could lead to consequences similar to what I faced before? Bradley raised his hands in a gesture of innocence. Not at all. I'm simply observing that development conflicts can become unpleasant when compromise fails. We're offering a reasonable middle path here. I left the meeting with a clearer understanding of what we were facing. Riverstone wasn't just proposing a development, they were continuing a multi-generational strategy to transform the entire region according to their vision, regardless of its impact on existing communities and agricultural operations. The next day, I shared the revised proposal and the details of my conversation with the coalition leadership. Opinions were divided. Some saw the modifications as a significant victory that we should accept, while others agreed with my assessment, that they represented tactical concessions rather than a meaningful shift in Riverstone's approach. After much debate, we developed a counter-strategy. We would publicly acknowledge Riverstone's willingness to modify their plans while continuing to oppose the fundamental rezoning request. Simultaneously, we would work with sympathetic county commissioners to develop a comprehensive agricultural preservation ordinance that would apply to all remaining farm parcels in the valley, essentially creating a legal firewall against future conversion of agricultural land. The weeks leading up to the commission vote were intense. Riverstone launched an aggressive marketing campaign promoting their revised plan, portraying themselves as responsible developers willing to compromise. Our coalition countered with detailed analyses of the proposal's remaining flaws and the importance of comprehensive rather than piecemeal planning. The night of the vote, the commission chambers were packed beyond capacity, with hundreds more people gathered outside watching on screens set up for the overflow crowd. After hours of public comment from both sides, the commissioners began their deliberations. Commissioner Martinez, who had emerged as our strongest ally on the board, proposed a compromise, conditional approval of a further modified version of Riverstone Commons, contingent upon simultaneous adoption of a new agricultural heritage district overlay that would provide permanent protection for the remaining farm parcels in the valley. The debate among commissioners was heated, with clear divisions between those who prioritized development and those concerned about preserving the area's agricultural character. In the end, after multiple amendments and procedural maneuvers, Martinez's compromise passed by a single vote. It wasn't a complete victory for either side. Riverstone would proceed with a scaled-down version of their development with additional restrictions beyond what they had offered in their revised proposal. But the new agricultural heritage district provided robust protection for the remaining farmland, including enhanced buffer requirements, restrictions on water usage that might impact agricultural operations, and tax incentives for maintaining land in agricultural production. As the crowd dispersed after the vote, Thomas Bradley approached me. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "The Heritage District will face legal challenges. Zoning changes can be reversed with changes in commission membership. This is a delay, not a defeat." Perhaps, I acknowledged, but it's enough time to demonstrate that agricultural preservation isn't just sentimentality. It's economically and environmentally essential to this region's future. In the months that followed, both sides worked to implement the Commission's decision. Riverstone began site preparation for the modified development, while our coalition partnered with county officials to establish the Heritage District framework. I found myself in a new role, serving on the advisory board that would help administer the district's programs and ensure compliance with its regulations. The battle had changed me once again. What had begun as a personal desire to protect my own farm had evolved into a broader commitment to agricultural preservation throughout the region. I wasn't just farming the land anymore. I was actively engaged in shaping the policies and priorities that would determine its future. One crisp fall morning, as I walked the boundary between my farm and what would soon become the edge of Riverstone Commons, I reflected on the long, strange journey that had brought me to this point. From the young man who just wanted a quiet place to grow vegetables, to the reluctant warrior against HOA overreach, to the community leader now helping guide the region's development philosophy, each phase had built upon the last, expanding my perspective and deepening my connection to this place. A conservation easement protected my farm. The Agricultural Heritage District now sheltered the remaining agricultural parcels. We hadn't stopped development entirely, but we had established principles and structures that would ensure balance and integration rather than wholesale transformation. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As I turned back toward my fields, I noticed a young woman giving a tour to elementary school children near the educational center. She was explaining the importance of pollinators, pointing out the native plantings we had installed to support bee populations. It was Alexis Winters, who had joined our staff as community outreach coordinator after the campaign against Riverstone. The site reminded me of the unexpected continuities that run through our lives. Harold Winters had farmed this land generations ago. His granddaughter Deborah had tried to destroy it out of misplaced grief and anger. Now, his great-granddaughter, Alexis, was helping protect and nurture it, educating a new generation about its value. The land endures, I thought, watching the children's excited faces as they spotted a monarch butterfly. It endures through threats of fire and development, through changing ownership and evolving purposes. And if we're fortunate, we learn to be good stewards not just of the soil itself, but of the communities and connections it fosters. Thomas Bradley was right about one thing. The battle would never be truly over. There would always be new pressures, new threats, new proposals that would require vigilance and advocacy. But standing there at the boundary between my farm and the encroaching suburban world, I felt a deep certainty that the work was worth it. Not just for me, but for all the people who had found connection and meaning in this place, and for all those who would come after us, inheriting the landscapes shaped by our choices. 3 years had passed since the compromise that allowed a scaled-down version of Riverstone Commons to proceed while establishing the Agricultural Heritage District. The development was now well underway, with the first phase of homes completed and occupied, commercial areas taking shape, and infrastructure extending throughout the property. The reduced golf course was being landscaped, its rolling contours visible from certain points on my farm. The Agricultural Heritage District had proven more robust than many expected. Despite Thomas Bradley's prediction of legal challenges, the framework had withstood initial attempts to weaken it. Several farms in the protected zone had taken advantage of the new tax incentives to invest in sustainable improvements, and agricultural tourism throughout the region had actually increased, partly due to heightened awareness generated by our preservation campaign. My own farm continued to thrive, though the character of our operation had evolved with the changing landscape around us. We had expanded our educational programming to meet growing demand, built a larger farm store to accommodate increased visitor traffic, and developed new partnerships with restaurants opening in the Riverstone commercial district. I had grown accustomed to the sound of construction equipment in the distance and the sight of new roof lines appearing beyond my eastern fields. It wasn't the peaceful rural setting I had originally sought, but it was a workable compromise. Or so I thought, until the morning Alexis burst into my office without knocking, clearly agitated. "Have you seen this?" she demanded, slapping a document on my desk. "It was filed with the county planning department yesterday afternoon." I picked up the papers and began reading. It was a formal request for a variance to the agricultural Heritage District regulations, specifically to allow a commercial water bottling facility to be constructed on the Hendricks property, a 200-acre farm located directly upstream from mine within the protected zone. "This makes no sense," I said, scanning the details. "The Heritage District specifically prohibits industrial uses unrelated to agricultural production. A water bottling plant clearly doesn't qualify." "Keep reading," Alexis instructed grimly. As I continued through the document, the strategy became clear. The applicant, Clearwater Artesian, LLC, was arguing that bottling naturally occurring spring water constituted an agricultural product, since it was harvested directly from the land with minimal processing. They cited precedents from other counties where similar operations had been permitted in agricultural zones. "Who is behind this?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Alexis flipped to the last page. "Look at the registered agent for Clearwater Artesian." There it was, Margaret Bradley, Thomas Bradley's wife. The connection wasn't immediately obvious unless you knew the family relationships, but it was unmistakable. To those of us who had been tracking Riverstone's activities, "The Hendricks farm," I mused. "Bill Hendricks is in his 80s now. I'm guessing they made him an offer he couldn't refuse." Alexis nodded. Bill's son confirmed that they sold the mineral and water rights to Clearwater 6 months ago, but kept the land itself. They thought they were just allowing some test wells, not a full industrial operation. When they saw the variance application, they called me immediately. The implications were serious. If approved, this variance would establish a precedent for industrial uses within the Heritage District, potentially undermining the entire framework we had fought to create. And the particular type of facility proposed, a water bottling plant, raised additional concerns about impacts on the local aquifer that all the farms in the area relied upon. "Has anyone notified the coalition?" I asked, referring to the Valley Agricultural Preservation Group that had come together to fight Riverstone Commons. "I've started making calls, but many of the original members have moved on to other issues since we established the Heritage District. Some feel like we already won that battle." Alexis's frustration was evident. "And this approach is clever. Positioning it as an agricultural use makes it harder to oppose without seeming anti-farmer." I studied the application more carefully. The proposed facility was substantial, 40,000 square feet, with capacity to bottle 150,000 gallons daily, drawing from deep wells that would tap the aquifer far below the level used by traditional agricultural irrigation. "We need hydrogeological expertise," I said. "Someone who can analyze the potential impact on water availability for surrounding farms." "Already on it," Alexis replied. "I've contacted Dr. Renee Chen at the university. She's agreed to review the application and provide an independent assessment." "Good. And we need to speak with Commissioner Martinez. She was instrumental in establishing the Heritage District. She'll understand the threat this poses." Alexis bit her lip. "That might be complicated. Martinez lost her re-election bid last year. The new commissioner for that district is James Wilson, who ran with significant financial support from development interests." The news was concerning but not entirely surprising. Political landscapes shift, especially in rapidly growing regions, where newcomers often bring different priorities than long-time residents. Then we build our case on facts, not political connections, I decided. Scientific evidence about water impacts, legal arguments about the intent of the heritage district, regulations and community testimony about the importance of maintaining agricultural integrity. We spent the next several days gathering information and mobilizing resources. Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis arrived quickly and confirmed our fears. The proposed extraction levels could significantly lower the water table in the surrounding area, potentially affecting all farms that relied on well irrigation. The shallow roots of my organic vegetables were particularly vulnerable to reduced water availability. The county scheduled a public hearing on the variance request for the following month. In the meantime, we worked to rebuild the coalition that had successfully fought for the heritage district. Some former members responded enthusiastically, recognizing the existential threat this precedent could pose. Others were hesitant to re-engage in what promised to be another contentious battle. Most surprising was the response from certain residents of Riverstone Commons itself. When word of the proposed facility spread, a group of homeowners who had been attracted to the development precisely because of its promised integration with the surrounding agricultural landscape contacted us about joining the opposition. There, Representative Daniel Sharma met with me at the farm one evening after most visitors had left. A software engineer in his 40s who had relocated from the city, he explained their position as we walked along the property edge, overlooking the partially completed development. We bought into Riverstone because of the marketing about rural character and farm-to-table living, he explained. The promotional materials featured images of your farm and talked about the agricultural heritage district as a permanent amenity. Now they want to put an industrial bottling plant upstream. That's not what we signed up for. His group, Riverstone Homeowners for Responsible Development, had already collected over 200 signatures on a petition opposing the variance. While their primary concerns were about traffic impacts and potential decreases in their property values, their opposition aligned with our agricultural preservation goals. Would your group be willing to testify at the hearing? I asked. Having Riverstone residents speak against this could be particularly effective. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. We've already been gathering personal statements and documentation showing how the rural setting was a key factor in our purchasing decisions. Some residents are even talking about potential legal action against Riverstone for misrepresentation if this facility is approved. This unexpected alliance energized our efforts, with residents from both the agricultural community and the new development united in opposition. The county would have to take our concerns seriously, regardless of political alignments. However, Clearwater Artesian was mounting an equally determined campaign in support of their application. They hired consultants to produce reports challenging Dr. Chen's water impact analysis, claiming their extraction would tap deeper aquifers that were independent from the shallow groundwater farmers relied upon. They emphasized job creation and tax revenue benefits. And most effectively, they framed opposition as anti-business overreach by preservationists seeking to prevent landowners from making legitimate economic use of their natural resources. A week before the hearing, Thomas Bradley requested a meeting at my farm. Against Alexis's advice, I agreed to hear him out, curious about what approach he would take given our previous confrontation. We met on the farmhouse porch, the same location where I had once sat with Deborah Winters as she shared her family's connection to this land. The irony wasn't lost on me. Another meeting with another adversary, discussing yet another threat to the farm's future. Bradley declined my offer of coffee, getting straight to business. This opposition campaign is unnecessary and potentially damaging to everyone involved. I'm here to propose an alternative that would address your concerns while allowing the project to proceed. I'm listening, I said neutrally. He outlined a modified proposal, a smaller facility with reduced extraction volumes, additional monitoring wells to track aquifer impacts, and a binding agreement to cease operations if measurable effects on surrounding agricultural water supplies were detected. Furthermore, he continued, Clearwater would establish a fund to support water conservation improvements for farms in the Heritage District. More efficient irrigation systems, rainwater capture, whatever would reduce dependency on well water. The offer was better than I had expected, addressing our most immediate practical concerns about water availability. But it still missed the fundamental issue. Once the precedent for industrial uses within the Heritage District was established, other variances would inevitably follow. Your proposal addresses symptoms, not causes, I replied. The issue isn't just water extraction, it's the integrity of the agricultural heritage district itself. If this variance is approved, what prevents the next application for a food processing plant, or an agricultural equipment factory, or any other operation that can claim some tangential connection to farming? Bradley's facade of reasonableness cracked slightly. This opposition is becoming personal, Miller. My family has invested millions in this region's development. We've created jobs, expanded the tax base, provided housing for thousands. And at every turn, you position yourself as the defender of some idealized rural past that economic reality has left behind. It's not about the past, I countered. It's about maintaining balance. The compromise that allowed Riverstone Commons to proceed was based on preserving agricultural uses in the designated Heritage District. Your family agreed to those terms. Now you're trying to redefine agricultural use to mean anything remotely connected to resources that come from the land. He stood abruptly. The hearing proceeds next week. I had hoped to avoid unnecessary confrontation, but you leave me no choice but to present our full case. I should warn you that we've uncovered some information about historic water usage on your own property that might be relevant if questions of water rights become central to this debate. The threat was thinly veiled. Are you suggesting there's something improper about my water usage? Bradley adjusted his jacket. Let's just say that records from the 1980s, when this property changed hands, indicate some irregularities in how water rights were transferred. Nothing that would affect your current operations under normal circumstances, but potentially significant if subjected to detailed legal scrutiny. After he left, I immediately called Marcus, the attorney who had represented me in the original HOA conflict and had since become a trusted advisor. I explained Bradley's implied threat and asked him to investigate any potential vulnerabilities in my water rights. Marcus's research confirmed my fears. During the farm crisis period, when Harold Winters had been forced to sell the property, there had indeed been a procedural error in how the water rights were documented. The issue had never been addressed because subsequent owners, including me, had continued the established patterns of water usage without challenge. But technically, my legal claim to the current volume of water I drew from the aquifer could be contested. It's a legal gray area, Marcus explained. You'd probably prevail in the end based on established use, but it could tie you up in costly litigation for years. Bradley's smart to surface this now. It puts pressure on you personally without directly relating to the variance request. The revelation added a layer of complexity to our opposition strategy. If I led the fight against the variance too aggressively, I might trigger a separate legal battle over my own water rights that could threaten the farm regardless of the outcome on the bottling plant. As I considered this dilemma, a surprising call came from Eleanor Patel, my longtime ally from the Groves, who had stepped back from community activism in recent years due to health concerns. "Jackson," she said when I answered, her voice stronger than I had heard it in months. Daniel Sharma just visited me about the water bottling situation. I think it's time for me to make a public appearance again. Eleanor's involvement could be significant. Though no longer holding any official position, she remained deeply respected throughout the community, including by longtime county officials who had worked with her during her years as HOA president and community advocate. Are you sure? I asked, concerned about the stress this might cause her. These hearings can become contentious. I'm 83 years old, she replied with a hint of steel in her voice. I've earned the right to speak my mind, and I was here before Bradley, before you, before any of these developments. I remember when this entire valley was farmland, and I've watched each piece disappear. The Heritage District was supposed to stop that process. I won't sit silently while they dismantle it through legal manipulations. With Eleanor's support, reinvigorating our coalition, we refined our strategy for the hearing. Rather than focusing solely on hydrogeological impacts, we would emphasize the legal intent of the Heritage District regulations and the broader principles of agricultural preservation they embodied. Eleanor would speak to the historical context, Dr. Chen would address the scientific concerns, Daniel would represent the Riverstone residents' perspective, and I would tie everything together from the standpoint of a working farmer whose livelihood depended on the district's integrity. The day of the hearing arrived with tension thick in the air. The county meeting room was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway outside. Local media had picked up the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the region's ongoing negotiation between development and preservation. Thomas and Margaret Bradley arrived with an entourage of consultants, attorneys, and supporters wearing jobs and progress buttons. They projected confidence, greeting commissioners warmly and distributing glossy information packets highlighting the economic benefits of the proposed facility. Our coalition gathered near the opposite wall. Farmers in work clothes, Riverstone residents in business casual attire, environmental advocates with their own informational materials. Eleanor sat near the front, straight-backed and dignified, drawing respectful nods from several commissioners who had worked with her over the years. The hearing began with a presentation from the county planning staff, who summarized the variance request and noted that their technical review had found it inconsistent with the stated purpose of the Agricultural Heritage District. This was a positive start, though the staff recommendation was advisory rather than binding on the commission. Clearwater's representatives presented next, making a polished case for the bottling facility as an appropriate use within the agricultural zone. They emphasized that water was a natural product of the land, that extraction would be sustainable and monitored, and that the operation would create 35 permanent jobs while generating substantial tax revenue. Their hydrogeologists presented models contradicting Dr. Chen's analysis, claiming the deep aquifer they would tap was separate from the shallow groundwater farmers used. When our turn came, Eleanor spoke first, her voice wavering slightly, but her message clear and powerful. She recounted the history of the valley's transformation, the compromises that had allowed development while preserving agricultural spaces, and the explicit promises made when the Heritage District was established. I was in this very room when you created the district, she reminded the commissioners. Some of you were here too. You pledged that these designated agricultural lands would be protected from industrial encroachment, not just for the current farmers, but for future generations. A promise made is a debt unpaid until it is kept. Dr. Chen followed with a methodical dismantling of Clearwater's hydrogeological claims, using visual aids to demonstrate how the deep and shallow aquifers were interconnected, how excessive extraction from any level would eventually affect the entire system, and how the proposed monitoring would detect problems only after irreversible damage had occurred. Daniel Sharma presented the perspective of Riverstone residents, complete with marketing materials from the development that highlighted the agricultural surroundings as a premium feature. We invested in this community based on representations about its character and the protection of surrounding farmland, he stated. Approving this variance would not only threaten that character, but would constitute a breach of trust with the very residents your decisions are meant to serve. When my turn came, I focused on the practical realities of farming beside an industrial operation. I explained how even small changes in water availability could devastate organic crops, how increased traffic would complicate movement of agricultural equipment, and how one exception to the Heritage District regulations would inevitably lead to others. This isn't about opposing progress or denying property rights, I concluded. It's about honoring commitments. The Heritage District was created as part of a compromise that allowed significant development in this valley. The agricultural community accepted Riverstone Commons because we were promised protection for the remaining farmland. That promise must be kept. The public comment period that followed was emotionally charged. Farmers spoke about multi-generational connections to their land. Environmental advocates detailed potential impacts on local watersheds. Economic development supporters countered with arguments about property rights and job creation. The commissioners listened attentively, asking occasional clarifying questions, but giving little indication of their leanings. As the hearing stretched into its fifth hour, Commission Chair Rodriguez finally closed public testimony and turned to his colleagues for deliberation. The discussion revealed deep divisions among the commissioners, with some prioritizing economic development and others concerned about precedent-setting exceptions to the Heritage District regulations. Commissioner Wilson, who had replaced Martinez and was known to favor development interests, argued forcefully for approving the variance with conditions addressing the water monitoring concerns. Two other commissioners seemed to be leaning his direction. Just as it appeared the variance might be approved, Commissioner Diaz, who had been largely silent during the proceedings, spoke up. Before we vote, I'd like to disclose something that came to my attention just yesterday. It appears that while this application was pending, Clearwater Artesian purchased options on 2 additional properties within the Heritage District, presumably for similar facilities if this variance is granted. The revelation changed the dynamic instantly. What had been presented as a single exceptional case was now exposed as potentially the first step in a systematic conversion of agricultural land to industrial use. Even commissioners who had seemed inclined to support the variance appeared taken aback by this information. Thomas Bradley rose to object to the introduction of unverified information at this late stage. But Chair Rodriguez overruled him, noting that the Commission was entitled to consider all relevant factors in evaluating the potential impact of their decision. After further deliberation, the Commission voted 4-3 to deny the variance request, with Commissioner Wilson and 2 others dissenting. The majority cited inconsistency with the core purpose of the Agricultural Heritage District and concerns about the precedent this would establish for future industrial applications. As the crowd dispersed after the decision, the mood among our coalition was one of cautious relief rather than outright celebration. We had prevailed in this particular battle, but Thomas Bradley's determined expression as he exited with his team suggested that the larger conflict was far from over. Eleanor gripped my arm as we left the county building. "This isn't the end," she said, echoing my thoughts. "They'll try another approach, another location, another definition of agricultural use. We need to strengthen the Heritage District regulations themselves, not just fight individual variances." She was right, of course. Our victory would be temporary unless we addressed the underlying vulnerabilities in the regulatory framework. And Bradley's veiled threat about my water rights still hung over my personal situation, a sword of Damocles that could drop at any time. In the days following the hearing, our coalition regrouped to discuss long-term strategy. Dr. Chen helped us identify specific amendments that would clarify the definition of agricultural uses and explicitly exclude industrial-scale resource extraction. Daniel Sharma committed to mobilizing Riverstone residents to support these improvements, recognizing that their property values were tied to the preservation of the surrounding agricultural character. Most significantly, Eleanor emerged from her semi-retirement to lead a new initiative called Heritage District 2.0, a comprehensive effort to update and strengthen the original regulations based on the lessons learned during the bottling plant controversy. We need to shift from defensive to proactive, she explained during a strategy session at my farm. Instead of waiting for the next threat and scrambling to oppose it, we should be building a stronger, clearer framework that leaves less room for exploitative interpretations. The work would be challenging and likely meet resistance from development, interests and property rights advocates, but the coalition that had come together to fight the bottling plant, traditional farmers, environmental scientists, and even new residents of the development itself, represented a powerful constituency that crossed conventional political lines. As I walked my fields that evening, watching the sunset illuminate both my crops and the rooftops of Riverstone Commons in the distance, I reflected on how much had changed since I first bought this land seeking solitude and independence. The quiet, isolated farm I had envisioned had instead become a focal point for community engagement, a living demonstration of agricultural viability and repeatedly a battleground for larger conflicts about land use and development. Yet despite the challenges and complexities, I wouldn't have chosen differently. This land had shaped me as much as I had shaped it, expanding my understanding of community, teaching me the necessity of engagement rather than isolation, and connecting me to a lineage of stewardship stretching back through Harold Winters and forward to the apprentices and visitors who carried these lessons into their own lives. Thomas Bradley and his family represented a different vision, one of constant growth and transformation, of land valued primarily for its development potential, rather than its inherent productive capacity. Our philosophies were fundamentally opposed, yet we were inextricably linked by geography and circumstance, forced to negotiate the shared landscape of this valley. As darkness fell, I made a decision. Rather than waiting for Bradley's next move, or the potential legal challenge to my water rights, I would approach him directly, not with confrontation or accusation, but with an invitation to explore whether our competing visions might somehow accommodate each other more gracefully than through endless regulatory battles. It was a long shot, perhaps naive given our history of adversarial encounters, but the alternative was perpetual conflict, with each victory by either side setting the stage for the next fight, each compromise ultimately undermined by mistrust and hidden agendas. I composed a letter that night, not as the public face of agricultural preservation or as Bradley's nemesis in regional politics, but simply as one landowner to another, suggesting that our shared interest in the long-term vitality of the region might be better served by collaborative planning than by strategic maneuvering. Whether he would respond positively was uncertain at best. But after years of reactive battles defending against various threats, taking this proactive step, however unlikely to succeed, felt like the right evolution of my role in this community's ongoing story. The farm would continue regardless, adapting as it always had to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The Heritage District would evolve, hopefully growing stronger rather than weaker with each challenge. And I would continue learning what it truly means to be rooted in a place, not isolated within it, but connected through it to the complex web of neighbors, allies, opponents, and partners that collectively shape our shared landscape. 20 years had passed since I sent that letter to Thomas Bradley seeking a different path forward. Now, at 68, I found myself sitting on the farmhouse porch with a journalist documenting the history of the Agricultural Heritage District. "So what happened after you sent that letter?" Maya Chen asked, tablet in hand. As Dr. Renee Chen's daughter, she had grown up hearing about the water bottling plant controversy. "Nothing immediate," I smiled. Bradley never responded directly, but Clearwater Artesian withdrew their options on the other properties, and the threatened legal challenge to my water rights never materialized, a detente of sorts. And Eleanor Patel's Heritage District 2, Zero Initiative? That was the real game changer, I acknowledged. Eleanor assembled a remarkable coalition. Farmers, environmentalists, property specialists, even development interests who saw the value in regulatory clarity. The amended regulations passed with stronger definitions of agricultural use and explicit prohibitions against industrial operations. The strengthened framework had indeed proven durable. Several attempts to introduce non-agricultural uses had been rejected, and the district had become a model studied by communities facing similar development pressures. "What about Riverstone? Commons?" Maya asked. I gestured toward the community visible in the distance, mature trees now softening its roof lines. They completed the residential sections, but scaled back commercial components. The most significant change came when Thomas Bradley's son, Michael, took over project management. Unlike his father and grandfather, Michael had studied sustainable development and incorporated urban agriculture as a central feature. That shift had been perhaps the most surprising development. Under Michael's direction, Riverstone integrated community gardens, edible landscaping, and small commercial growing operations. Instead of merely marketing proximity to farms as a lifestyle amenity, they had made agriculture part of the community's design and function. Michael approached me about collaboration, I explained. His perspective was different from his father's. He saw preservation and development not as opposing forces, but as potentially complementary approaches to land stewardship. Our partnership had grown over time. My farm became a training ground for Riverstone's community gardeners. We developed scaled-down sustainable farming techniques for urban settings and created a joint internship program that taught both commercial-scale organic farming and urban agricultural approaches. And Thomas Bradley's reaction to his son's different approach? Maya asked. Puzzlement initially, but when the integrated model proved both popular and profitable, Thomas became more supportive. He's a businessman after all. Success speaks its own language. Our relationship had evolved from antagonism to a wary mutual respect, though we would never be friends. "Let's talk about Eleanor Patel's legacy," Maya suggested. I nodded, feeling a familiar pang of loss. Eleanor had passed away 5 years. Earlier at 98, engaged in community affairs until her final months. Eleanor understood that true community requires diversity, not just of people, but of landscapes, activities, and purposes. She saw that a region composed entirely of suburban development would be inherently unstable. Eleanor's vision had expanded far beyond the initial HOA context. Through the Heritage District work, she had developed a broader perspective on regional planning that balanced development needs with preservation of working landscapes, influencing policies at county, state, and even national levels. "And what about your own legacy?" Maya asked. "After the bottling plant conflict, you became much more involved in regional planning and agricultural policy. Was that a natural evolution?" I considered the question, looking out over the fields where interns harvested early summer vegetables. Natural isn't the word I'd choose. Necessary, perhaps. I came here seeking isolation and ended up at the center of community building. My reluctant activism had expanded beyond the original HOA conflict. I'd served on the County Agricultural Advisory Board, the Soil and Water Conservation District, and a state-level commission developing farm preservation strategies. Each role had pulled me further from the fields and into policy discussions. "Do you regret that shift in focus?" Maya asked. "Sometimes," I admitted, "especially on beautiful days when I'd rather be working with plants than people. But sustainable agriculture isn't just about growing techniques or land management. It's equally about the social and political ecosystems that either support or undermine farming." We paused as a tour group passed by, led by Alexis Winters, now the farm's education director. At 55, she had developed powerful programs that brought thousands of school children through the farm annually and trained educators to incorporate food systems knowledge into standard curricula. "The apprenticeship program seems especially important to you," Maya observed, nodding toward the young farmers in the fields. "It's how we build continuity," I confirmed. "Farming knowledge isn't just academic, it's experiential, contextual, tied to specific places. The program ensures that knowledge continues and evolves." Over the years, more than 200 apprentices had trained here, many establishing their own operations or taking leadership roles in agricultural organizations. The Harold Winters Agricultural Scholarship, originally funded by Deborah's Trust, now supported 10 apprentices annually, creating a diverse cohort of next-generation farmers. "What are your succession plans for this farm?" Maya asked. "The farm's future is secured through multiple mechanisms," I explained. "The conservation easement ensures it will remain agricultural regardless of ownership. The Educational Center has its own non-profit structure that will continue operating independently, and I've established a transition process that will eventually transfer operational control to a cooperative of former apprentices who share the integrated vision." That transition had already begun, with 3 key graduates taking on increasing management responsibilities. The cooperative model would ensure that no individual bore the financial burden of acquiring the entire property, while maintaining unified management of the agricultural, educational, and community functions. "One last question," Maya said. "When you look back on everything, the HOA conflict, the fire, the lawsuit, the battles over development, do you ever wish you had chosen a simpler path, found that quiet, isolated property you originally wanted?" It was a question I had asked myself many times. There were certainly moments when I fantasized about selling everything and moving somewhere remote without neighbors or development pressures, I admitted. But the truth is, I'm not sure that place exists anymore, at least not where farming is viable. I gestured toward the landscape visible from the porch, my fields, Riverstone Commons, and the mix of developments and protected agricultural lands beyond. Agriculture doesn't happen in isolation. It's embedded in communities, economies, ecosystems. The conflicts and challenges actually created something more meaningful than I would have found in isolation. They forced me to develop relationships, to understand different perspectives, to see this land as part of a complex community tapestry. I thought about the unlikely connections, Eleanor becoming a mentor and friend, Alexis becoming an essential partner, even the Bradley family finding a way to integrate rather than eliminate agricultural elements in their vision. The farm I envisioned would have been simpler, I concluded. Just me and my crops living quietly, but it would have been smaller too, not just in acreage, but in impact and meaning. Through all these challenges, the farm became something I couldn't have imagined, a nexus for community building, educational transformation, policy development, and cultural change. As Maya left to interview Michael Bradley in Riverstone, Residents, I walked into the fields where the apprentices worked, feeling the familiar pleasure of soil underfoot. Farming remained the foundation of everything, the daily practice of nurturing life and working within natural systems. Whatever roles I had taken on in policy or education, my identity remained rooted in this fundamental relationship with the land. The barn that had burned 20 years ago had been rebuilt stronger. The community relationships that had begun in conflict had been reconstructed with greater resilience. And the land itself, despite all pressures, continued its ancient work of transformation, taking sunlight, water, and nutrients and converting them into nourishment for the community of which it was an integral part. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.